Hey everyone, Noah here. Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at another of the critical theories of international relations, namely Marxist and Neo-Marxist approaches. Marxism has its roots in the economic analysis and critique of capitalism developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 1800s. Marx and Engels were primarily concerned with understanding how capitalism functioned as a system. Marx wrote very little about what a post-capitalist system might look like. That work was undertaken by Vladimir Lenin, among others. Lenin used Marx's critique of capitalism to advance his understanding of the revolutionary cause in Russia. He was also one of the first thinkers to use Marx's critique of capitalism to understand global politics. More recently, Marxist approaches to international relations have been foundational to other critical theories, including post-structuralism and some varieties of feminism. Theorists like Samir Amin and Andre Gunder Frank have updated Marx's framework through dependency and world systems theories, and Robert Cox and Stephen Gill have drawn on the works of Antonio Gramsci and other Marxists to develop theories of political economy. We'll consider these approaches in more detail in just a little bit, but first, let's look at what Marx himself thought. Before examining Marxist approaches to IR, though, it's briefly worth addressing critiques that the approach is no longer relevant, particularly after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. For Marxist critics, the collapse of communism around the world invalidated Marxism as a political project. And I think there's an element of truth to that. Communism as a political project appears to be on the ropes. The standard Marxist defense is that Russia, Cuba, and others were never truly communist societies. Rather, they were better thought of as state capitalism. By that, they mean that the political economy of the Soviet Union, Cuba, and even contemporary China were organized around the exploitation of workers by the state rather than by private corporations. That is to say, under a state capitalist system, economic activity is organized and managed by state-owned businesses, but the organizing logic of that system remains centered on extracting labor from the population. In other words, the economy is essentially run as a single large corporation owned by the state. But that said, Marx's critique of capitalism can still offer some insights into the functioning of international relations, particularly in the field of international political economy. As Alan Meeksons Wood wrote in Back to Marx in 1997, we're living in a moment when, for the first time, capitalism has become a truly universal system. It's universal not only in the sense that it's global, not only in the sense that just about every economic actor in the world today is operating according to the logic of capitalism, and even those in the outermost periphery of the capitalist economy are in one way or another subject to that logic. Capitalism is also universal in the sense that its logic, the logic of accumulation, commodification, profit maximization, and competition, has penetrated just about every aspect of human life and nature itself. For Meeksons Wood, in other words, Marx's criticism of capitalism is more relevant than ever precisely because capitalism has finally reached a stage where it's truly universal. Now we'll look at Marx's explanations and some of these core concepts in just a moment. But does Wood's central point, that capitalism has truly reached a global status, that globalization continues, and that inequality is increasing hold true? Most of the data available to us today suggests that it is. And when we look at the data on global inequality, some interesting features emerge. This chart graphs the percentage of wealth held by the top 1% of households in the United States. It's based on data collected by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it finds that since the 1970s, the level of wealth concentrated in the top 1% of households in the United States has increased from about 22% in 1978 to about 39% in 2016. Similarly, the wealth held by the top 10% of American households has increased over the same period from a low of about 65% in the 1980s to about 78% by 2016. What's more, it's widely believed that the trend line for both of these groups continues to increase and that we're returning to levels of inequality in the United States not seen since the era of the Great Depression. The United States is not alone in this respect. Around the world, intra-country inequality is increasing. While there has been some progress in reducing the number of people living on less than $1 per day, the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in countries around the world has continued to increase. Credit Suisse International's annual Global Wealth Report is telling. According to their 2018 report, the top 10% of the world's population controls about 84% of the wealth worldwide. Broken down in more detail, the report indicates that the top 0.8% of the world's population, about 42 million people in total, control about 44.8% of global wealth, with assets totaling more than 142 trillion US dollars. This translates to an average of about $3.4 million per person. Conversely, the bottom 69.3% of the world's population, some 3.2 billion people, control about 1.9% of global wealth, translating to an average of about $2,000 per person for the bottom half of the world's population. Not surprisingly, the wealthiest people are disproportionately located in the global north. Some 41% of the world's millionaires are in the United States, which is home to just 4.5% of the world's population. By contrast, China, which is home to about a fifth of the world's population, is home to just 8% of its millionaires. The 10 countries listed here, the top 10 for number of millionaires, are home to 81% of the total world's millionaires. By contrast, the other 180 or so countries, where approximately 3/4 of the world's population reside, have 19% of the world's millionaires. There are other ways to break down this data on global inequality. The richest 1% of the world's population earn as much income as the bottom 57%. The world's richest 50 million people earn as much income annually as the bottom 2.7 billion people. The top 10% of the world earns as much as the bottom 90%. The US has 4% of the population but consumes 25% of the oil. And about 1 billion people still live in extreme poverty, that is, on less than $1 per day. But for Marxist IR scholars, the primary takeaway is this: that global inequality remains a defining feature of the world economy. Understanding the source and impact of economic inequality is thus the primary goal for Marxist IR. So how does Marxist thought help us make sense of these dynamics of global inequality? Let's start with the basics. Marx believed that the economy of society, that is, its mode of production, determines power relationships in society. That is to say, for Marx, all societies were defined by the division of society into haves and have-nots. In capitalism, we have workers, or the proletariat, and the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie. Under feudalism, we had peasants and lords. Under slave-based economies, we had slaves and slave owners, and so on. Marx believed that the antagonistic interests between these two groups, or classes, defined the central conflict of all societies. The conflict between these classes was not, for Marx, due to individual interests or the behavior of any individual actor. Instead, they were systemic, a result of the natural functioning of the system. Capitalists do not exploit workers simply because they're bad people. Rather, for Marx, anyone in the role of capitalist would have been forced to behave in a similar way or be driven from business through competition. What made capitalism as a system unique was the market dependence that existed. What does that mean? It means that workers and capitalists were both dependent on the market to secure their means of social reproduction. If you don't work, you don't get paid, and if you don't get paid, you don't eat. This differed from previous economic systems like feudalism, where social obligation mitigated the economic impact of coercive economic relations. Under capitalism, social relations and social reproduction were subsumed to market forces. Further, Marx believed that crises were a natural part of the functioning of the system and were, as a result, largely unavoidable. All of this can give Marxism a very deterministic feeling: actors without agency, unavoidable and unalterable dynamics, and so on. And this is one of the criticisms that's sometimes leveled against Marxism. One of the central concepts in Marx's analysis was the mode of production, which Marx divides into two portions. The mode of production itself was a specific combination of productive forces like labor, tool, technical knowledge, and so on, which Marx refers to as the means of production, as well as the social and technical relations that maintain that system, which Marx refers to as the relations of production. Together, the relations and means of production comprise the economic base of society. That is to say, any economic system was comprised of a specific combination of productive forces, tools, technologies, people working in specific ways, and so on. They're also comprised of the social relationships like property rights, power, work relations, rules, and so on. Together, these factors comprise the mode of production. In a capitalist mode of production, we have specific rules and systems like wage labor, private property rights, and so on that look very different from feudal and slave-based economies. These are different modes of production, Modes of production, such as slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, are relatively stable and can last for centuries. At the same time, they're also in a constant state of evolution, transitioning from the previous mode of production, and contain tensions that can create pressures for change. On top of any economic base, the social relationships are built. Marx referred to this as the superstructure. The superstructure builds on and reinforces the base. The superstructure is comprised of all those other forces that influence and relate to production but are not immediately part of it. Law, culture, politics, education, science, ideology, art, and so on. These are all reflective of the broader economic relations that undergird society. According to Marx, there's a reciprocal relationship between the two. The base shapes the superstructure, which in turn helps maintain and legitimate the economic base. As we'll see in a couple of minutes, this base superstructure metaphor has given rise to criticisms of economic determinism against Marx. That is to say, Marx puts the economy at the center of his analysis and argued that other social relationships were simply reflective of economic relationships. For his critics, this is too simplistic and ignores the possibility of change brought about through the superstructure. Before we move on to consider contemporary Marxist approaches to IR, let's conclude our consideration of classical Marxism by looking at its key elements. Marx believed that capitalism functioned as a system not due to the free choices of individual actors. Competition compels certain behaviors on the part of capitalists who are forced to innovate, expand, and become more efficient to remain in business. Failure to do so would drive them from the ranks of the bourgeoisie and into the proletariat, as they'd be unable to compete against capitalists who did. Thus, for Marx, capitalism always led to a greater concentration of wealth and growing inequality. This competition imperative also led to innovation and efficiency, but forced expansion and growth as well, an ever-increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a smaller and smaller segment of the population. Second, Marx argued that the normal functioning of the economy resulted in a series of perverse outcomes. The most notable of these was class conflict that Marx believed necessarily resulted from the normal functioning of the economic system, not from the ill intent of individual actors. And finally, Marx also believed that capitalism would suffer from periodic crises that threatened the economic system, including crises of overproduction, declining profits, and that these crises had to be addressed primarily through intervention on the part of the state. We'll discuss these in more detail in a few weeks when we discuss international political economy. All of this led to criticisms of economic determinism. That is, for Marx, individual agents have little real agency or autonomy. They're instead driven by economic forces outside of their control. Now, as I said before, Marx's analysis was largely confined to the critique of capitalism we just examined. But many theorists took Marx's basic framework and applied it explicitly to international relations. We'll look at 4 of these now: Lenin's theory of imperialism, Samir Amin's dependency theory, and Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, and Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony. While Vladimir Lenin is perhaps best remembered as the leader of the communist revolution in Russia in 1917, that revolution that led to the establishment of the Soviet Union, he was also a theorist of international relations. His most well-known work in this respect is Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Published in 1917, the same year as the Communist Revolution, Lenin was seeking to explain why, counter to Marx's prediction, the Communist Revolution was occurring in Russia. Remember, at the time, Russia was considered the economic backwaters of Europe, relatively poor, and certainly not the economic powerhouse of Germany or Great Britain. If Marx was correct and capitalism resulted in the exploitation of industrial workers, why were peasants, rather than those industrial workers, the ones rebelling and establishing communist systems? Lenin explained this dynamic by applying Marx's general framework to the international system to understand relations between colonizing and colonized states. In its simplest formation, Lenin argues that colonization and the expansion of financial rather than productive capital permitted capitalist countries to generate greater profits, which could essentially be used to buy off what he called the labor aristocracy of the global north. Essentially, Lenin contended that workers in the global north were able to enjoy a higher quality of life because of the hyper-exploitation of workers and peasants in the global south. As a result, Lenin asserted that revolutions would likely begin in the global south, not in the relatively developed global north, as Marx had predicted. Lenin's basic framework was taken up and expanded on by other theorists in the 20th century. The first group of theorists were the dependency theorists. Dependency theory is an interesting one, if for no other reason than it was one of the first theories of development that emerges from the global south, with its most important contributions coming from theorists in Latin America in the 1960s. Egyptian theorist Samir Amin, who coined the term Eurocentrism, argued that the world economy was structured in such a way as to facilitate the dependency and exploitation of the global south. Working with Latin American economists like Argentinian Raul Prebisch, who confirmed the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that the relative value of primary commodities exported by developing countries would tend to decline over time, a concept we're going to return to later in the course, Amin argued that the structure of the global economy made it difficult for the global south to ever develop or catch up. Amin's dependency theory was taken as the foundation for Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory. World systems theory argues that the world economy is divided into three broad groups: the core, periphery, and semi-periphery, much like domestic economies are divided into workers and capitalists. For Wallerstein, the natural functioning of the global economy privileges the core and disadvantages the periphery. From this perspective, development becomes exceedingly difficult. Indeed, one of the most important contributions of dependency theory and world systems theory may be the idea of the development of underdevelopment. From this perspective, colonialism resulted in the active underdevelopment of the global south. While the global north may have at one point been undeveloped, it was never underdeveloped. The lessons learned from the experience of the global north are therefore limited in relevance for the global south. We'll return to this theory in a couple of weeks when we talk about development. Let's look at another subset of Marxism after Marx. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist thinker and organizer, writing during the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini in Italy in the 1920s. After Mussolini imposed his dictatorship over Italy in 1925, he sought to consolidate his power by arresting opposition leaders. Gramsci was among those arrested. While languishing in prison, Gramsci tried to make sense of workers' support for far-right fascist leaders in Italy. From his perspective, it made little sense that workers would align themselves with the far right, with whom they had little in common. Gramsci believed that they should naturally be predisposed to support the communists and other progressive parties, but their support for the far-right fascists was unwavering in Italy. Why? More broadly, Gramsci wanted to figure out why the communist revolution had been so elusive in Italy and elsewhere in the West. To explain that, Gramsci had developed two central concepts which have been widely adopted by IR scholars even outside of Neo-Gramscianism today. The first of those theories was Gramsci's theory of hegemony. Gramsci engaged in an interesting thought experiment or dialogue with another Italian theorist that we know, Machiavelli. Now, in The Prince, Machiavelli famously asks whether it's better for a prince to be feared or loved. And how does Machiavelli answer the question, is it better to be feared or loved? He argues in chapter 17 that one should wish to be both, but because it's difficult to unite them in one person, it's much safer to be feared than loved. He continues, quote, "Because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, as is said above, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. And that prince who, relying entirely on their promises, has neglected other precautions, is ruined. Because friendships that are obtained by payments, and not by greatness or nobility of mind, may indeed be earned, but they are not secured, and in time of need they cannot be relied upon." Machiavelli thus concludes that it is better for a prince to be feared, because love is fickle and masses can change their mind. But Gramsci argues that Machiavelli got it wrong. From Gramsci's perspective, the most powerful position is one in which your ideas are taken for granted as common sense, and not subject to contestation in the first place. Quite contrary to Machiavelli, according to Gramsci, reliance on force represents weakness, not strength. For Gramsci, hegemony represented the most powerful position for any class. Now, Gramsci understood hegemony as intellectual and moral leadership, a situation in which the moral, political, and cultural values of the elite came to be accepted by society as a whole as common sense. This, for Gramsci, was the most powerful position a ruling group could find itself in, far more powerful than the simple reliance on force. Various neo-Gramscian theorists took Antonio Gramsci's framework and applied it to the international system. The most well-known of them is Robert Cox, the same Robert Cox who warned us that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. According to Cox, the international system must be understood as an outgrowth of the interaction of three variables: institutions, ideas, and material capabilities. None of these are determinate, but instead they both challenge and reinforce one another in reciprocal ways. Power is a function of these three variables. The extent to which one actor or social group can coalesce these three variables of power into a single regime accepted by other actors determines the scope of hegemony in the international system. In other words, according to Robert Cox, dominant powers in the international system shape the world order to suit their interests, not only through coercion, but through the generation of broad consent or even support for that world order, even among those who are disadvantaged by it. Other scholars have taken Cox's charge and applied it to contemporary international problems. Other actors have taken Cox's charge and applied it to contemporary international problems. Take, for example, support for free trade and neoliberal economic ideology among leaders of developing countries. Why do leaders in Mexico or Argentina support market-based systems that, according to Marxists, hold little benefit for their countries? One possible explanation rooted in Cox's work is that those leaders have bought into the hegemony of neoliberalism, and that they genuinely believe that the free market is the best path forward for progress and development. So that concludes our consideration of Marxist and Neo-Marxist approaches to IR. I hope you found it useful. Be sure to watch the other videos covering the other critical approaches to the study of international relations. Thanks, everyone. Bye.